What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2003 BMW E46 M3. Today on the M3 behind me, we're going to be doing an extensive coolant overhaul. So what does that mean? That means we're going to be replacing coolant hoses, water pump, thermostat, expansion tank, fan clutch, fan, as well as upgrading the radiator. That's going to be the main component of today's DIY, is upgrading the stock unit to the CSF triple pass radiator. Triple pass meaning that the coolant goes from the inlet to the outlet 3 times through the radiator versus the standard single pass OE unit that's currently in there. Typically, your coolant components are going to last anywhere from 80 to 100,000 miles. Granted, they have been known to last longer. Sometimes what you'll see is a failing O-ring before a failing water pump or a failing thermostat. In some cases, these expansion tanks are notorious for cracking. So overall, a pretty standard interval of 80 to 100K, but they have been known to last longer than that. BMW also recommends you do your coolant flush every 2 to 4 years, so just keep that in mind. This DIY is going to be applicable if you're looking to just replace your water pump and thermostat, your radiator, your expansion tank, your coolant hoses, or the whole system like we're going to do today. We're using a CSF radiator. We have a genuine BMW expansion tank. We have some OEM coolant hoses from Rhine. We have our Giba water pump, a new water pump pulley, our new thermostat, fan clutch, and fan. But before we get started on this install, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. For this job, we have a couple basic tools we'll be needing, as well as a couple nice to haves that we'll talk about. Starting with pliers, I have a different array of pliers here. Most importantly though, I have some Oettinger style pliers, which will be needed for the expansion tank specifically. So if you're going to be replacing that, I recommend you have a set of those. We have a flathead screwdriver for all our hose clamps. You can sub in a 6mm socket for that. We have a small pick just to be handy. You never know what electrical connectors may be stuck, and or it can also come in handy to free up some stuck coolant hoses. We have a 3/8 drive ratchet as well as a 1/4 inch with some extensions to accommodate just a couple different lengths. We have a 3/8 drive torque wrench. We have a 10mm and an 8mm socket. We have a T25 and a T30 as well as an 8mm hex. We have our fan clutch tools, which consist of a 32mm wrench. This one's a thin one, which makes it a little bit easier to do this job, as well as a counter hold. You can sub that out with a homemade 32mm wrench and a long pry bar or flathead screwdriver. Some nice to haves, but not mandatory of course, are an electric ratchet just to speed things up a bit, a paint pen for when you torque down your bolts, a little bit of Scotch-Brite pad for the surfaces behind the water pump and the block so you can clean up that mating surface. And then today we're going to be using a vacuum filler to bleed our cooling system. However, these cars are pretty easy. You can do the traditional raise up the front, use the engine kind of thing to bleed out that coolant system. And then something that you should always have but not pictured here is a catch can for your coolant. You want to make sure you dispose of that properly. Otherwise, this is all that you're going to need. Now we know what tools we're working with. Let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, starting underneath the hood of the E46 M3, we're going to work on removing some of the plastic bits that are in our way to do this job in full. So we're going to start by removing our cowl, moving on over to our air box, and then we'll head underneath the vehicle and work on removing some other things out of the way. So pretty straightforward. To get started up top, we have 4 expanding rivets that we need to remove to get this intake piece off. So let's get started with that. Now there's a bunch of tools you can use for this. You can use trim removal tools. I like using these small pliers. They have just enough bite to remove the heads of these expanding rivets. All right, with those 4 removed, we should be able to lift this up. Take this piece with you and just set it to the side. With that removed, we have a better view of the upper fan shroud as well as our upper radiator hose, which we'll get to in a little bit. While we're up here, we're going to go ahead and work on removing our air filter box. To do that, you're going to want to disconnect your mass airflow sensor. You have a tab on either side. You're going to want to press and pull back on. Set that wiring to the side. A flathead screwdriver or a 6mm socket will get you to the hose clamp so that you can loosen that up. From there, we're going to want to remove our 2 electrical connectors for our headlight ballast. To get these out, you're going to want to pinch the top and bottom portion of the clip to get that off. Same thing with the second one. Just set those over to the side for now. Then to remove this cover, you simply grab it and pull up. Just be gentle. It's got 3 small clips that hold it into place. With that exposed, we have a better view of our hardware that secures our airbox in place. Now we've removed our cover. We have 2 10mm bolts and a 10mm nut to remove so that we can free up this ballast as well as our airbox. So using a 10mm socket on an extension, let's zap those off. All right, that should allow us to free that up. Now with our ballast out of the way, we can work on removing our airbox. There's also a piece of ducting that it connects to down underneath the headlight, so just keep that in mind. With that removed, I'm gonna go ahead and set the ballast back in place just so it doesn't fall by accident. And I'm also gonna go ahead and gently, just finger tight, reinstall the hardware. That way I don't misplace it and I know exactly where it goes for when I go to reinstall everything. From here, we have this part of the shrouding that is held on by 2 expanding rivets. You have one up top, which you can see ours is missing. And you have one on the bottom, which we have the base of left. We'll have to replace that. But you could use the same plier and flathead method like we did, or use a trim removal tool. So we'll replace that for this car once we reinstall everything. And now on most E46s, you're gonna have the same shield on the passenger side of the engine as well. As you can see, our car is completely missing that, but the idea would be exactly the same. You have a rivet up top and an expanding rivet at the bottom. From there, we have just a small hook that kind of keeps this locked into the fan shroud assembly. You lift up, and that'll free it up. We'll be able to remove this once we have drained our coolant and we disconnect our upper radiator hose. All right. At this point, we can go ahead and work on freeing up our fan shroud before we head underneath. Where's my hardware? To do so, while I have you on this side, we have a T25 to remove underneath our upper radiator hose. So here's our T25 we're going to remove using a T25 socket on my 1/4-inch ratchet. On the passenger side, we have a little bit more hardware, so let's head over there. On the passenger side, we have another T25 as well as some electrical connectors to remove. So let's go ahead and do that. We have this upper unit for the fan, so we're gonna go ahead and simply detach that from the actual shroud. These ones are usually just clipped in there. Pull that off, set it to the side. From there, we have our harness that goes to the fan. You want to go ahead and press on the tabs on either side of the connector and just pull up. Same thing, tuck that over to the side, and then we can access our T25 and free that up as well. Unlike newer cars, this fan shroud has a couple more T25s holding it down below. So we're going to go ahead and get those as well. One thing to note, your top passenger side T25 is going to be the longest one out of all the fan shroud T25, so just don't get that mixed up. Again, lengthy one, passenger side, top corner. With that situated, we're going to go ahead and break free our fan and fan clutch assembly from the water pumps. That way, once we head back up top from removing the last bit of our hardware underneath, we can just pull the whole assembly out as one. So let's get our fan tool for that and get ready to break that free. Grab your counter hole tool, and you can use a pry bar or a long flathead screwdriver. As mentioned earlier, sometimes you need to rotate the pulley so you can get your counter hole tool on properly, as these screws are not perfectly squared on the water pump. They're a little bit rectangle, if you will, the layout of them. All right, with that situated, we'll grab your 32mm wrench. This is a reverse thread setup, so you're going to want to go towards the right clockwise to break this free. With our fan broken free now from our water pump, we can go ahead and head underneath the car and work on removing the rest of the hardware that holds our shroud on, as well as getting our oil cooler out of the way. So let's get to it. Underneath the M3, we have to remove our belly pan, which is held on by 7 8mm bolts. So let's go ahead and zap those off. I'm going to use the electric ratchet and an 8mm socket on a small extension. Just pull down and slide back, and then go ahead and set this to the side. Now with our shield removed, we're going to go ahead and remove our oil cooler out of the way. It's going to be held on by 2 T25 screws. I also advise you have a bungee cord or some zip ties so you can go ahead and pull it off to the side and kind of hang it off, maybe the sway bar or your steering rack, whatever you have more access to. So let's go ahead and get situated with that. Our first T25 is located on the passenger side. Use a T25 on a long extension. There's one. Now let's head over to the driver's side and do the same thing. Second one is same idea on the driver's side. And with that freed up, just a matter of sliding it back and off to the side. We're going to grab some zip ties and go ahead and situate this around the sway bar. That should be more than enough to keep it out the way without putting too much stress on our lines. Now that that's cleared up, we can go ahead and remove the final 2 T25s under here for the fan shroud so we can work on pulling that out. All right, we have our T25 here on the driver's side that we need to free up. Just going to zap it off really quick with the electric ratchet. And we have the same thing on the passenger side. With that removed, now we can head back up top and work on removing our fan and fan shroud assembly. We're going to finish spinning off our fan from our water pump. Just be mindful that the fan will just drop once it's off of the water pump. So be ready to catch it if you can. However, we're replacing both the fan clutch and the fan today, as well as the radiator, so we're not too concerned about nicking stuff up on the way out. And then from here, getting out the fan shroud, it's just a matter of picking which side you want to work on. I'm going to lower down the passenger side and lift up the driver's side so that I can clear the upper radiator hose. Don't forget to free this electrical plug as well. You could have left it together or separated, whichever one is easiest for you. And then go ahead and just set this over to the side as well. Now we're going to go ahead and remove our temperature sensor connector as well as free up our clip for our lower radiator hose so that we can get ready to drain the coolant out. To free that up, you're going to want to press down on the metal clip here and pull up. And that comes off very easily. I'm going to use a small pick. You can use a flathead screwdriver. Basically, the idea is to raise the metal clip here. And I'm going to go ahead and just remove it in full since we are replacing this lower radiator hose anyways, just to make the chances of this coming off a little bit easier. These tend to get pretty tight on there, and over time between crud and the seals drying out on the exterior side of things, they get a little bit tough to come out. So we're going to go ahead and give us the best chance at freeing that up. Now let's set up our drain pan and get ready to remove this lower radiator hose. All right, before we go ahead and get ready to drain everything, we're going to go ahead and remove our expansion tank cap just so that the system can flow a little bit better. And it goes without saying, but just as a friendly reminder, you always want to do this on a cold engine. You never want to work on this when it's hot. You don't want to open up anything when it's warm, as you're going to either burn yourself or create bigger problems. So this car has been sitting in the shop overnight. It's stone cold. We're going to go ahead and remove our cap. And now we're going to get our drain pan situated underneath and go ahead and free up that radiator hose. All right, now we're just going to go ahead and free this off from the radiator neck. Again, as I mentioned, these can be often tight, and depending on the age of your radiator, if you're not replacing the radiator, you want to be very careful with that, as sometimes the neck will crack when you're putting pressure on it. So we're not too concerned. We're doing the hose and the radiator, but again, if you're not replacing it, be very, very gentle with it. I'm going to grab a small pry bar and just pry against the metal portion of the radiator to see if I can get it started a little bit easier. Again, being very, very careful here. Obviously, if you're retaining the radiator, just be mindful of where you pry and how you pry. I'm putting very little pressure on this. I'm just doing it repeatedly, and you can see the hose is starting to come off. I'm going to go ahead and let that do its thing for a little bit. With our lower radiator hose freed up and our system mainly drained, now we can go ahead and work on removing our upper radiator hose. And just a quick tech tip, If you're not going to go ahead and drain the block underneath the, I believe it's number 5 or 6 header manifold to free up most of the coolant, what you can do is use some shop air or a shop vac and use some forced air through the top of your expansion tank just to free out the rest of the system. Again, we are going to be bleeding this, so we're not too worried about the air that we've introduced. So, like we did on the lower, I'm going to use a small pick and just work on freeing up both of these clips, and then we'll work on working it off the top of the radiator hose. Yeah, I'm going to use a small pick. You can use a small flathead screwdriver. We're going to work on freeing up our expansion tank hose first, then do our upper radiator hose. I'm going to remove the clip in full just to give us a better chance. I'm going to do the same thing with the expansion tank one. This is just overkill. If you're not replacing these hoses, just be mindful that you can't get these clips separately, so you don't want to lose them. I'm going to start by freeing up the expansion tank hose first. Just be careful, as these age, they get very brittle and they can just break. And we can free up the shroud finally. And then while we have this loose, we'll also go ahead and remove it using a small flathead and get that off. That way we have more room to free up this radiator. So let's grab a screwdriver and do that. And using a flathead screwdriver, you can also use a 6mm socket. I'm going to go ahead and free that hose clamp up. You want to free it a good amount, as these kind of bite into the hose, and over time they really notch themselves in there. Now with that, we can go ahead and try to break this free. Sometimes twisting them helps, but it all depends on if they've ever been off before or not. And there you have it. Go ahead and set this to the side if you're going to be hanging onto it. However, we recommend you replace them, as the O-rings in here get really flat over time, and it gives you a potential location for a leak if you're not replacing them. Now that we have our fan shroud out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the last T25 that holds our radiator in place. So that's located right above the upper radiator hose neck, right underneath the radiator support. We're just going to zap it out with the electronic ratchet and our T25. Now we can go ahead and tilt our radiator forward. Just be mindful, some more coolant may drain out. Now we can go ahead and pull it up carefully. Definitely been in here a long time. You can see all the crud that has built up around the edges. Definitely slowing down the efficiency of the radiator. All right, let's go ahead and get this out of here. Now we have our radiator out of the way, we're going to work on freeing up our water pump pulley. And what we're going to do is we're going to break the 10mm nuts first before we remove our belt, using the tension from the belt to keep everything from spinning. Once we do that, then we'll fully remove our belt and go from there. So let's get to it. Right, we have 4 10mm bolts. I'm just going to use 10mm on a socket just to break them free. They shouldn't be very tight, as they should only be torqued down to 10 Newton meters. Now with those freed up, we're going to grab an 8mm hex and feed it into the center of our tensioner. This is a hydraulic tensioner. You want to make sure the 8mm hex is situated all the way in. This is kind of a weird design. There's supposed to be a dust cap on here that you want to usually pop off before you get started using a flathead screwdriver or a small pick. This one was missing it. So as you can see, there's a bunch of crud in here. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to replace this while we're in here. All right, now pushing down clockwise, we're going to free up our belt. That should give us more than enough slack to get our belt off the water pump. I'm just going to go ahead and release that. For now, that tool can live in there. We're not going to use it for anything else. But now that our water pump is free, let's go ahead and remove the rest of those 4 10mm bolts. Beautiful. Now we have a better view at our water pump. All right, with that freed up, I'm going to go ahead and work on disconnecting the lower radiator hose. You could argue that you can just pull it out with the thermostat in one piece if you're replacing everything, but if I don't have to fight it or jam it into anything while that comes out, I'd rather just make my life a little bit easier, do things the right way, and free up this clamp. Again, flathead screwdriver or 6mm socket will work. Once that's nice and free, just go ahead and break the seal. should be able to pull this hose off. I still have my drip pan under here just in case anything else were to come out. All right. Right now we're going to work on freeing up this electrical harness from our thermostat / engine bracket using the butt end of the screwdriver. I'm just going to push that through. And there's that. Now we're going to grab our 10mm socket and work on removing these 3 10mm bolts up top. All 3 of these bolts are the same length, so don't worry about mixing them up if you separate them from the bracket. Now with our bolts removed from our thermostat, it should be a matter of just pulling it towards us. We have a O-ring that seals it to the water pipe back here, or coolant pipe, and then we have an O-ring that it sits on, or our thermostat also sits on top of the water pump. So I have my drip pan underneath ready to go in case more coolant comes out. Oh, there goes our thermostat. That was sitting right here. That fell down with the gasket. Here's that water pipe I was talking about. Now in some cases, when you pull this off, it's either going to separate from this end or it's going to separate from this end. Either way, the kit includes the O-ring for either end. They're the same one. So we'll go ahead and leave this as one, and we'll separate and remove that O-ring and replace that when we reinstall everything. All right, my good people, now we have our water pump to remove. It's held on by 5 10mm bolts. You have 2 up top. Those are going to be longer than the rest. So you want to make sure the 2 long ones stay up top. And you have 1, 2, and a third underneath that's a little bit hidden. So just like we did with the thermostat, we're going to grab our 10mm on our electric ratchet and just zap them off. Just be mindful, this is going to be full of coolant, so you want to keep your catch pan ready to go underneath the car. You're going to have a water pipe here that you're going to disconnect from the water pump as it comes out, and a water pipe right up top as well. This coolant pipe is held by a 10mm bolt on the exhaust side of things that we're going to go ahead and free up. It is going to be held by a 10mm bolt, so we'll grab our 10mm socket. I'm using a flex head ratchet here, but you can probably squeeze something else in here. I'm just going to go ahead and break it free. Once it's broken free, you should be able to get it the rest of the way by hand. With that removed, we should have plenty of play to get this hose off. All right, with that hose freed up, we're actually going to go ahead and pull this coolant pipe out, and we're going to have a lot of coolant come out the side there, so get your drip pan ready. And now with that, we can go ahead and pull our water pump out. And here's a view of our pump. You can see the gasket stayed behind. We want to make sure we get that off. There's some plastic that was trapped in the fin here, so it's a good thing we took this out. Let me set this pump to the side, and then we'll show you what else needs to come off. All right, now that we have our water pump off, all we have to do is remove the 2 O-rings from those 2 water pipes, our old gasket, and just kind of clean up the general area. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, you have your top water pipe here, using a small pick to get this old O-ring off. There's one. We have our second water pipe here. You can see these O-rings are pretty flat, and these have been in here for 4 years. There's 2. Again, these 2 come with the kit. Then we have our water pump gasket, which you want to be very careful about. I'm going to grab a small razor blade and work on scraping the rest of it off so I don't accidentally mar any of the sealing surface. So let me grab that. Before we install any new parts, we're going to work on cleaning up our area down by where the water pump sits. Since the oil filter housing is located right above, over the years and any spills that may have happened during oil changes, they start to cake up around that. Combine that with an old leaky valve cover gasket, you end up with a ton of crud down there. So we're going to soak that with some degreaser. While we let that do its job, we're going to work on continuing the removal of our old expansion tank, starting with the small connecting hose that connects the tank to our metal pipe that feeds into our water pump, which you saw earlier. We're going to replace both that tank and the hose. So let's get started on that, and we'll go from there. Similar to the radiator hoses, these have a small locking clip. Lift that up, and then it's just a matter of working it off. Use a small flathead to pry. Again, we are replacing both of these components. If you're not replacing your tank, then you want to get ahead to the assembly portion. With that freed up, we'll come back to this once we get the tank out. Next, we're going to want to work on removing our expansion tank hose. Small screwdriver, pick will work as well. I'm going to pry this protective cover off. And then you want to just break this clamp off. And I'll just go ahead and cut this old clamp off. I'm using some dikes here. And once that's popped off from there, you can go ahead and simply rotate it, or you can fully remove it, whichever is better for you. We're going to go ahead and pull it off and set it to the side up here for now. We'll come back to that. With that removed, next we have a 10mm bolt that holds our expansion tank to our strut tower. 10mm socket on the ratchet. You have your windshield washer fluid reservoir that clips onto the tank itself. Press in on this tab, you can see some of ours is missing, and lift up just enough to separate it from the tank. And then we're going to go ahead and start pulling this up. We have our electrical connector underneath for the level sensor, which we're going to get to once we raise it up a bit. Otherwise, it is just held on by some rubber grommets. Just like that. Go ahead and disconnect your electrical connector, as the tank comes with a new sensor built in already. And voila. While we have this off and we have plenty of room, we're going to work on disconnecting the rest of this expansion tank hose from our metal hose. You want to note the orientation of the hose when you install your new one. You don't want to put it in backwards. Again, we undid that 10mm bracket bolt that holds this bracket in place just so we can have some more play with it. Out with the old. Beautiful. We'll tuck this back down there. And then we'll grab our new expansion tank and get ready to install it. All right, now that we have our old tank out, we can go ahead and install our new one. One thing to note is the tanks do come with their vent hose already attached. There's a small locating clip back here. Just feed it there, it kind of just rests there, goes down the strut tower. So let's get this situated. We're going to start by plugging in our new level sensor, and then we'll sit it down on these two posts that feed into the rubber grommets and go from there. Okay, we have our level sensor. Nice and plugged in, secured, locked. We'll feed down our hose as we go down. We'll line up dowel 1, dowel 2. And bam, baby, right into place. Before we do anything else, let's feed in our 10mm bolt. And now we're going to go ahead and feed in our reservoir. That just clips in there for the windshield washer fluid. Next, we're going to go ahead and reconnect that lower hose down below that we just replaced that comes off our metal coolant pipe. Here that is. Make sure your lock is lifted up. And I'm going to go ahead and lubricate that a little bit with some coolant. Give me one moment. Let's have some coolant on my finger here. That'll help the O-ring seat itself when it goes in. You can use water too. Lock that in. Before we go ahead and install this expansion tank hose, we're going to go ahead and just situate it over to the top of the cowl and kind of forget about it. The reason for that is if we put it back in, it's just going to be in the way of us installing the water pump and the thermostat and the radiator, and we don't want to damage it. So we're going to go ahead and just rest it up top. But we have our new clamp on it ready to go. So before we fill the system up, we'll go ahead and install it and bleed the coolant system. So set that to the side for now. However, if you're just doing your expansion tank, go ahead and reinstall. All right, now with that situated, let's go ahead and get our O-rings, get those situated on our water pipes, and then we'll get ready to install our new water pump. We got the top one here. And then we're going to do the same thing to the bottom one here. And then we're going to lubricate both of these with some coolant. I'm just going to dip my fingers in the new jug. I have some clean gloves, or I use a clean glove, and we'll get some of that lubricated. You'll note the water pumps have 2 locating dowels on them. Those will allow you to get them gasket situated as well as get the pump situated on the block. Okay, with that in place, we can go ahead and feed that towards the block, and we'll grab our 2 bolts. These are the 2 longer ones, and feed those in just to get this situated. We'll go ahead and feed this in. Make sure this pipe is out of the way. And then we have to make sure that our water pump is mated flat to the surface of the block. All right, that looks pretty good. Now let's get our hardware ready. All right, we'll start our top right one by hand. We want to make sure you start all of these by hand. And we're going to feed our coolant pipe into the water pump. You hear that snug pop into place. Same bolt that holds that pipe secure holds our water pump to the block. So again, 2 top long ones up top, and then we'll do our shorter 3 around the side and the bottom. Once you have them all started by hand, you can go ahead and snug them down with the ratchet, and then we'll torque them down. We're going to go ahead and torque these 5 10mm bolts down to 10 Newton meters. All right, I'm going to go ahead and mark these just so I know that they've already been torqued. Before we do anything else, let's go ahead and grab that small 10mm bolt that we took off of this metal pipe and go ahead and feed that back in. Again, that's located by the exhaust side of things. It's a little tight to get to, but you should be able to get it started by hand and then put your 10mm socket on it. You may need to move the bracket a bit to get it to line up with the block. Once you get it just started, you should be able to get it in by hand a little further. And then we'll go ahead and just snug it down with the ratchet. If you can fit a torque wrench in there, you want to torque it down to, same thing, about 10 Newton meters. It's not a whole lot, it's just holding the bracket in place. All right, nice and snug. With that situated, we can install our thermostat seal on our water pump like that. Get that situated. Does not hurt to coat it with a little bit of coolant just to act as a sealing agent. Now we're going to get our thermostat ready, and we're going to go ahead and replace both the O-rings on that water pipe that we showed you earlier, just so that we don't risk a leak in the future. So here's our thermostat housing that we pulled out earlier. As you saw, the pipe came out with it. So while I have the pipe here, we'll go ahead and take the old O-ring off and install the new one. Now the kit only comes with 1. However, we recommend you purchase 2 just in case your pipe comes out like ours did. And you can go ahead and replace both ends just to feel better about it. Here's the inner one. I'm going to go ahead and pop that seal off. Put our new one on. So now both ends are replaced. I know I said I was only going to do one at first, but I felt better doing both. And slip that back in. Now from there, you can feed your thermostat in. And now that it's fully situated, we can go ahead and install this back on the car. With our water pump situated, we can go ahead and install our new thermostat housing and thermostat. You already saw us replace the seals on both ends of the tube. So I would recommend doing both if both of them come out, although this tube is easy to pull out should it be on the coolant pipe still. Thermostat's in. Let's go ahead and feed this in gently. We want to make sure that this seals against the water pipe and that the thermostat stays flush in place. One thing I want to note when you're installing this is you saw ours came out with the pipe. We took it off to do the seals. Well, to install this, it's easier to have the pipe on the engine side first. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. So the trick is to put the pipe in first if it came out with your housing, and then you can feed the thermostat and housing in. Once you have that in there, just take a look around the ends with a flashlight. You want to make sure that the O-ring isn't sticking out or it looks pinched. With our thermostat situated in place, we can go ahead and install our mounting bracket, or I'll say our hoist bracket, and our 3 10mm bolts. You want to make sure you start all of these by hand first. And we'll go ahead and just snug them up really gently with the electric ratchet. And then we'll go ahead and torque them down to 10 Newton meters, or 7.5 foot-pounds. Go ahead and give those a little paint mark just so we remember that we torqued them down already. And then we'll go ahead and reinstall our grommet here that holds our wiring in place. Just press this into place like so. Awesome. All right, now that we have our thermostat situated, I'm gonna go ahead and install our lower radiator hose. You're also gonna wanna install your new temperature fan switch, coat it with a little bit of coolant, feed that into the housing. When it goes one way, it is a keyed sensor. Beautiful. Make sure you orientate your hose clamp in a way that you can get to it with a screwdriver, but also not interfere with the fan blade or anything else. We're gonna go ahead and install our hose clamp the way the old one was situated, kind of flush against the front like this. Using a flathead screwdriver to tighten this down. You can also use a 6mm hex. Either one will work just fine. All right, that's nice and tight. We're gonna take our cap off of our water pump here before we forget. Now we're gonna grab our new water pump pulley and get that started. Grab your 4 10mm bolts and get that started. Once we put our belt back on, we can go ahead and torque those down. For now, let's work on doing that. So let's get our belt situated. We still have our 8mm hex on our tensioner here. Now that we have our belt on, we can torque these 4 bolts down to 10 Newton meters. That was all 4. They seem to click better when they're on the lower position here. This isn't going to do much for us, but it'll just help us remember that this is done. Now we have our water pump, our thermostat, our belt, our pulley, all that good stuff situated. We can go ahead and work on installing our new radiator. So let's grab that CSF and get ready to drop it in. All right, before we install the new CSF unit, it's important to note that they also supply hardware for the fan shroud and oil cooler. So instead of using the same T25s, now you have some hex bolts. So I recommend you remove these before you install the radiator, just so you can have them handy and they don't get in the way of your install later. You're gonna have a total of 2 in the front, 1 here under the top radiator neck, and then you have 2 at the bottom for your oil cooler. All right, now with that removed, we can go ahead and work on feeding it in. You wanna make sure that both this tab and this tab locate themselves into the plastic carriers in between the frame rails, which you can't miss as we feed this in. A good way to make sure your radiator is in, if you hold it up top here, assuming that your hardware is back in place, and you reach down below and you try to pull it forward, it should not come out. It should be keyed in to the small spots or the small feet in between the frame rails. So it's a good way to check. With our radiator in place, we need to reinstall our T25 up by the radiator neck. Just till it's snug. It is a metal screw going into plastic, so it doesn't need to be that tight. While we have this here, we're gonna go ahead and lift up the new locking clip on our lower radiator hose. I've already lubricated the O-ring before dropping that in there. I lubricated the neck on the radiator. We're gonna go ahead and feed that in. Once you have it situated all the way in, go ahead and lock it down. And then while we're here, we can also go ahead and connect our electrical connector for our fan switch. Remember, metal clip facing towards the engine. Beautiful. We have our new fan clutch and fan assembly. You can reuse the hardware from the old one. It's going to be a T30. So I already snug out the hardware. I'm going to go ahead and install it on our new fan clutch. Again, T30. You want to make sure you're installing your fan blade on the correct side of the fan clutch. A, by looking at the direction of the fans. B, the side that the clutch faces away from the engine should be smooth and a little bit deeper. The back side is going to be a little bit more shallow, should be almost flush with the back of the fan clutch, and it's also ridged. So with that situated, we're going to go ahead and feed this and our fan shroud in at the same time while we still have space without the upper radiator hose in our way. So we have our fan shroud. Just going to go ahead and kind of sit it like that. We'll grab our fan, we'll get that in here, and we'll lower our shroud some more. So it's roughly situated. And if you remembered, this fan clutch is reverse thread, so now we're going to want to spin counterclockwise to get it started. Okay, once you have it situated, you don't have to worry about it falling. We can focus on getting our fan shroud lined up properly. We have a notch in the radiator up top that the shroud hooks onto. And we have one below as well, which we'll show you when we get down there. Once you have that roughly in place, go ahead and loosely install your upper piece of hardware that holds the shroud to the upper radiator here. That's going to call for the 10mm bolt that came with your new CSF unit, or your T25 if you're installing your OE style radiator. All right, we'll leave that loose for now. Now we'll head over to the top passenger side and work on getting our really long T25 that we're going to reuse the old hardware for and get that started over here as well. I'll line that up there. You also want to make sure that the small fin on the fan shroud sits into the lower tab above the lower radiator hose. It's pretty straightforward. Once we get a couple teeth in by hand, we can grab our T25 on our ratchet and send it in the rest of the way. Again, nice and hand snug. Before we install any of the electrical harnesses back up top here, we're going to head down below, situate our lower T25 or our new 10mm bolts as well as our oil cooler, and then we'll continue from there. All right, down underneath the M3, we can see our bottom of the shroud is lining up pretty good. So we're going to grab our new 10mm bolt from CSF. Again, T25 if you're installing an OE piece of hardware. Then we'll grab our 10mm socket and our ratchet and just snug it down. Now let's head over to the driver's side and do the same thing. Here's that bottom piece of the shroud that also clips into this notch on the middle of the lower part of the radiator. So you want to make sure your fan shroud engages in there properly. Back on the driver's side, we have our other spot for our 10mm bolt. We have two more pieces of 10mm hardware that CSF gave us for our oil coolers. We have one down here, one on the opposite side. So with that being said, let's free up our oil cooler from the suspended zip ties here and get that going. There's a hook on either end of the oil cooler. You can see right above my finger. You want to make sure that notches into your radiator here before you install your new hardware. And it should look something like that, and it should be able to hold itself up. Now you can grab your new 10mm bolts and get those started. Using a long extension and our 10mm socket, you can go ahead and feed that up there. Now we can head over to the passenger side and do the exact same thing. Now we're going to go ahead and install our splash shield. It's held on by 7 8mm bolts. You want to make sure it feeds in under the bumper first and then tucks up by the metal stiffening plate. And we'll just take our 8mm socket and snug them up with our ratchet. With that all situated, we should be pretty much good underneath the M3. Let's head back up top and we'll work on buttoning up the rest of this cooling system. All right, now back up top, we have that 10mm bolt still that we left loose when we were adjusting our fan shroud. And if I didn't mention it already, the fan itself is going to self-lock into place, if you will, the second you start the motor, as it is reverse thread. So you don't really have to do too much there. So let's tighten up that 10mm bolt, and then we're going to proceed on getting some of our hoses ready. All right, nice and snug. Spin the blade a couple times, make sure nothing's hitting. That looks great. Now let's set up, grab our expansion tank hose. We'll get that situated, and we'll also plug in our electricals on the passenger side of the engine. All right, on the passenger side, we're going to wrap up our electrical before we put on our expansion tank hose. So as you remember earlier, we undid this plug. Technically, you could remove it as one and just slide it out of that keyed spot on the fan shroud, but at the time I found it easier to separate them. Tuck it back into place there. And you have your other electrical connector here. This one clips onto the fan shroud itself, just like that. Pretty straightforward, just kind of bites on, doesn't go anywhere. Our expansion tank hose will hook up to the bleeder here, and then it'll run down the tank, clip into there. Following along the front, you have 1 and 2 clips on the harness that hold the line in place. Coming down along, you have 3 tabs on the front of the radiator support where the line itself has 3 clips that just kind of help stay in place. So we got that situated. We have our new hose clamp ready to go. We'll leave that just like that. I'm tucking the line underneath the radiator support for what it's worth, just so you can do the same at home. And then we'll grab our Autocur style clamps, or pliers I should say, and we'll go ahead and crimp this down. That's nice and snug. And then if you remember, this also had a small cover on it. Then you can go ahead and place that right on top. It has a little notch in it for the top of the hose clamp. With the passenger side of the vehicle situated, now we're going to head over to our drivers. We'll get our upper radiator hose installed, our secondary shroud, our airbox, all that good stuff. All right, now we're going to take our upper radiator hose. I have it started with my hose clamp facing the way I want it. This one's going to be facing forward so I can get to it with the screwdriver easily. You're also going to want to remember to put your fan shroud on when you install the upper rad. For now, we can just go ahead and get the hose fed onto our thermostat housing. We have a good angle for it to get to our radiator. Now I'm going to take my fan shroud. Again, our vehicle only has the driver side one. You should have a driver and passenger side fan shroud. This has a small hook on it. You want to make sure this hooks into your fan shroud assembly so that it locks into place, as well as the 2 expanding rivets that hold it into place. And then while we have some play in there, let's grab our expanding rivets. If you remembered, ours were missing at the beginning. We're going to go ahead and install some fresh ones. We have one that sits literally at the opening where the radiator hose goes through. We have one rivet that goes up here. I'll use the end of a flathead screwdriver just to kind of press it in. And then we have one more up top. Again, this top one would lock in both shields if your vehicle is equipped with both of them still. Same idea, push it into place. And then down to lock it in. Now you can tell ours has a bit of a gap because we are missing the second shield, so that plastic thickness is not being made up with anything there, but at least it'll be sturdy and held in place. Now with that situated, we can go ahead and work on plugging in our upper radiator hoses. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and lubricate the ends or the ends of the O-rings, just so that it can all go into place a little bit easier, especially since these are both new parts. You want to make sure you pop up the locking clips, and then we'll start with the main radiator hose. Then we can key in the expansion tank hose and kind of just work in both at the same time. Expansion tank hose is in, lock that into place. Radiator hose is situated nicely, lock that into place. Give everything a firm pull. That all looks great. I'm going to remove my 3 10mm pieces of hardware that hold in our ballast so I can get my airbox fed into place. Right now we're going to reinstall our airbox. If you're using a stock unit like we are, you have a channel that's notched out on the bottom of the airbox that's going to key into the frame rail on the driver's side. You also want to make sure that you feed your feed tube up into the ducting underneath the headlight, and then obviously get your mass airflow sensor situated onto the intake boot. So let's go ahead and feed that in. There you go. It's basically going to fall into place. You want to make sure your 2 bolt holes for your 10mm bolts are lined up on the strut tower as well. While we have you here, let's go ahead and tighten down our hose clamp. I'm using a flathead screwdriver. Again, a 6mm socket will work. Next, don't forget about the mass airflow sensor. Remember, we tucked that wiring up above the intake boot earlier. And then just slip it onto place. Listen for that satisfying click. And now we can grab our headlight module or ballast and set that back ready for install. I'm just going to position my module back over the strut here. Kind of line that up. We have one 10mm. We have a second 10mm. You want to start these by hand. You don't want to cross thread them. Once those are started, you have your 10mm nut up top. And we'll just use the electric ratchet and snug them all down. Now we can take our cover and clip that back over our ballast. And then we can plug in our electrical connectors. Beautiful. Now we can go ahead and install our ducting piece up top. And then one thing to note before we install this cowling is if you're going to bleed your car the traditional method, your bleeder screw is located under the ducting here, so you want to keep this off until you do that. We're going to use our U-View vacuum filler, so we're going to go ahead and bleed from the expansion tank, but just note that that's located right there. That just sits like that, and then we got some new rivets that we'll install. We have a total of 4. Now that we have all this situated, the last thing left to do is bleed our coolant system. So let's go ahead and grab some coolant. We'll set up our U-View and we'll fill this baby up. All right, my good people, we are ready to fill our S54 with coolant. Now I wanted to make a note, again, we are using a vacuum bleeder. However, these cars are pretty easy to bleed at home, in the driveway, in the garage. The idea being is that you want to have the front end propped higher than the rest of the vehicle. You crack it open, fill with some coolant. Inside the vehicle, you want to have it in accessory mode so that you can turn on your heater. That way the heater valve opens. You want to have it set to the highest heat setting. Fan can be at the lowest fan setting. And then from there, you're going to fill the system and it's slowly going to burp itself, again, with the elevation being helpful in this situation. From there, if you wanted to, just to be a little bit more extra with it, you can then turn on the vehicle, let it idle for a little bit, give it a couple revs, just to really force the last bit of trapped air through the system. Again, using your expansion tank and your bleeder valve in conjunction. Today, we have some shop air, so we're going to go ahead and just use the vacuum bleeder, vacuum out all the air, and then fill it with some fresh coolant. Now I have 2 gallons of coolant ready to go here. I have a gallon of BMW concentrated, as well as a gallon of water mixed in here. Distilled water is preferable. So we're going to go ahead and set up our vacuum bleeder. I'll show you how that's done. This is also helpful because if the tool leaks, obviously aside from the tool being faulty, then we know that there is a leak somewhere in the system. So we want to avoid filling it with fresh coolant if it's going to leak out. You can also use a pressure tester in conjunction. Now on the top of our tool here, there's a gauge. For this tool specifically, we want to get it over between the 20 and 25 mark before we start filling, just to make sure that the system has vacuumed enough air out of it and that it's also holding. So we'll keep an eye on the gauge to make sure it doesn't drop below that. So let's get our tool situated, close our valve, and then pressing on the metal tab on the button, we'll go ahead and start vacuuming out the system. It's normal to see the coolant hoses collapse when you do this. Now we've given the tool some time to sit here. We've checked to make sure that the pressure did not drop. We're going to go ahead and fill the line so we can prime it. And by that, I mean I'm just going to crack the valve slightly until this whole line fills up with coolant. Then I'm going to go ahead and suction out the air one more time just for a hot minute, just to make up for any air that was brought in from the line. And then we'll go ahead and crack the system open and let the whole thing fill. You want to make sure when you're using one of these tools that the end of your line is always at the bottom of your bucket. Otherwise, if you suck up any air, you're going to render this whole job useless. Okay. I'm going to suction for 1 hot second. And now I'm going to crack that free. And then with one hand, I'll keep the end of my line in the bucket. And we'll just go until it stops taking coolant. All right. For this car specifically, you want to check your tank. It'll tell you how to tell when the system is full, especially when it's cold or warm. On this car, it tells you when it's cold. You want to have your little bobber sitting at the very top of the threaded portion of the tank. So ours is pretty much there. Now from here, what we're going to do is we'll run the car a couple times. We'll make sure that we have heat. We'll make sure that there's no more air trapped in it. And once we let it fully cool down again, we'll check our coolant level to make sure she is indeed full. There's always a possibility that there's a tiny air pocket somewhere that just did not make the cut. So otherwise, at this point, our system's full. We'll go ahead and we'll run it, and we'll go from there. And there you have it, my good people. Otherwise, another DIY in the books. A little bit of an invasive job, but otherwise pretty straightforward and still kind of simple on these old S54s. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. I know we did a bit of an upgrade, but we also have stock air boxes, so things can look a little bit different on your end. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.